Hello, I'm George Patterson. I'm here coming from Riverside City College, here interviewing Chris, who's going to give us an example of what supply shocks are. How you doing, Chris?
Hi, George. Nice to meet you.
Chris, can you give me one good thing that I need to know? What are supply shocks?
Well, you do need to know the definition of a supply shock, and a supply shock is an unexpected event that changes the supply or of a product or commodity, resulting in a sudden change in its price.
Oh, that's very interesting, Chris. Could you provide me with a couple examples of how supply shocks will affect our economy?
Well, actually, you need to know that there are two different types of supply shocks. There are adverse supply shocks and beneficial supply shocks. And an example of a adverse supply shock would be OPEC in the 1970s increasing its price, actually quadrupling its price, lowering the supply, making everything more expensive. And a beneficial supply shock, like the tech boom in the 90s, the dramatic or rapid increase in technology allowed producers to produce more items and it allowed them to lower the prices.
Wow, so two different types of supply shocks. That's very interesting, Chris. Thank you for your time, sir.
Not a problem.
We're going to be going over to my colleague now, who's going to interview another student from RCC, who'll give us some of the different things that supply shocks affect supply and demand.
Hi,
Thank you.
I'm Daisy Sanchez, and I'm here with RCC student Ermias. Hi, Ermias. Nice to meet you too. And you're here today to explain us how do supply shocks impact the aggregated supply and demand model?
Yes, exactly, Daisy. Earlier, my colleague Chris, he explained what supply shocks were, how there are adverse ones as well as positive ones. And I'm just going to show you how they affect the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve. And so normally the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve, the aggregate supply curve will normally shift outward, and the same with the aggregate demand curve over time, because over time aggregate demand with population growth, there'll always be more demand, so will shift outward, and aggregate supply, as more workers enter the workforce and technology improves, it will normally shift outwards. However, in the case of an adverse supply shock, such as in the 1970s, there were both crop failures as well as OPEC raising oil prices, which was the most significant one, and an adverse supply shock. So while the aggregate demand on a normal rate, it will still shift outward to about this point. This would be AB1. So while the aggregate demand shifts normally, the aggregate supply is going to shift inward in the opposite direction it would normally go. So it goes this way. So our old equilibrium point was right here, while our new equilibrium point is right here. And as you can see here, there's both a decrease in production as well as a vast increase in price, which is why an adverse supply shock is something that we do not want, because it leads to less of something and we have to pay a lot more for it. However, on the other hand, we do have positive supply shocks, which will move such as the tech boom in the late 1990s, since we had such a affected, many new firms entered in, so while the aggregate demand just went on the normal rate, let's go to about right here, this will be AB1. Normally this aggregate supply, it would only shift out to a point of right about here, which would create this equilibrium point. However, with a positive supply shock, it will shift out much further. So we go out to about this point. As you can see, this is the original equilibrium point to the new one, there's a vast increase in production and the price actually went down. So obviously a positive supply shock is something that we do want in our economy, however those aren't quite as prevalent as the adverse supply shocks have been over time.
Okay, thank you for that, Ermias. That was a great demonstration. And now we go to my colleague, he's going to interview a different student about how fiscal policy impacts the ASAD model. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Amy Hernandez, and I'm here with student Ermias to talk about the fiscal policy and the impact it has on the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model.
Oh, thank you, Amy. Yeah, well, first off, I would just like to explain what fiscal policy is. And it's essentially just the tools that the government has in terms of both spending and taxation in order to affect the aggregate demand. It's mainly used to affect the aggregate demand curve. For contractionary fiscal policy is when if we're in an inflationary gap and we need to rein in the GDP a little bit. In that situation, we'll either reduce spending, government spending on government purchases or transfer payments. Otherwise, we'll increase income taxes, and that will cause the aggregate demand curve to shift inward like this. And as you can see, it lowers GDP and lowers the price level. So we are reducing inflation, but we are creating a little bit more unemployment. But that's usually when we're in an inflationary period. And then we also have expansionary fiscal policy. In that case, either we will increase government purchases or transfer payments. Otherwise, we will decrease income taxes. And in that situation, we'll see the aggregate demand curve shift outward like this, which will increase production as you see GDP rises, but also it will increase inflation as the price level also goes up. And in terms of how the fiscal policy affects the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve in the long run versus the short run, it has much more effect in the long run because as you can see, the multiplier effect, it takes a while to get going in the economy. For example, and the multiplier effect is whenever there's a change in investment, there will also be a change in how much we consume. So for example, if the government increases their purchases by $1 million, then of that, if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, that means 75% of that $1 million is going to go back into the economy, and that keeps going and going. As you can see, originally it's 1 million, and then it goes to 750,000, and 75% of that, and on, to the point where a $1 million increase in government spending increases GDP by 4 million. And as you can see, it's less with taxes because that's a direct investment, and this is indirect. So while the $1 million here is going directly into the economy, if there's a $1 million tax cut, we won't see it until $750,000. So in the short run, it won't have much of an effect on the aggregate demand curve just because it takes a while for all this money to filter through the economy to go from business to business. Tax reduction or the government spending increase reduction, well, that mainly affects aggregate demand. There are some politicians who suggested we have supply side cuts, which would affect the aggregate supply curve, and those are typically well, it does do on income taxes as well, but it's mainly on capital gains tax, personal savings taxes, and those are just tax decreases where it's just trying to get people to work more, save more, and invest more. And while these do have somewhat of an effect, they do shift aggregate supply out just a little bit, although not as much as they were hoping for. And so we'll shift it out to about here. But the problem with these is those tax cuts will actually lead to aggregate demand shifting way more than aggregate supply. So it leads to see at the same time that's shifting out just a little bit, the aggregate demand curve will shift out even farther. So in the end, it's just affecting aggregate demand curve again. So usually we would just go with the either the increase or decrease in government purchases, otherwise, or just increasing or decreasing income taxes. And essentially, that's how fiscal policy affects the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves.
Okay, so now you guys understand what a supply shock is and what kind of types of supply shocks there are. Also, hopefully you understand what a supply shock does to the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model.
Finally, we learned what fiscal policy was and how that also affects aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So thank you guys for viewing our somewhat boring video. Hopefully it wasn't too bad on you guys. And just like to thank all my group members. We all contributed very hard towards this. Hope you guys have a great day.